And so we are going to be talking tonight about understanding the autistic profile of pathological demand avoidance, which is really designed for all of us, all as individuals, families, and professionals, to learn about the characteristics of PDA and ways to support the PDA profile of autism. So we're very excited about this tonight. And before we get into introducing our wonderful speaker, I did want to mention that if, in fact, you are in need of language support interpretation services, there will be a link in the chat that will be put there if it hasn't been already, and you can use that so that you can get interpreter services for the session tonight. And I know that a lot of people have already asked me because they're like, this is going to be a really cool session. Is it going to be recorded? It is being recorded, and we will be uploading it to the Federation website. So if you happen to be one of many who are trying to balance being able to participate in this and taking care of the other things that are going on in your home, no worries. You'll be able to refer to it later. Okay? So without further ado, Diane Gould is Gould is the founder and executive director of PDA North America. She's a licensed clinical social worker that specializes in serving autistic individuals. And as executive director and founder of PDA North America, she has founded the annual PDA North American Conference held in Chicago that has changed the lives of hundreds of PDA families. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about that conference very, very soon. She has a private practice in the suburbs of Chicago where she serves neurodivergent children, adults, and their families. And over the past 40 plus years, apparently she started when she was 5, she worked with both private agencies and school systems. Diane has a childhood disability and family support specialist for the Jewish Children's Bureau for over a decade and created many types of programs and support groups, family camps, and parent education. She has also established inclusion consultation and home visiting programs, and she has worked for 2 special education cooperatives, which resulted in working in 14 schools during her career. So needless to say, she has quite the breadth of experience. And I could spend a lot of time talking about all of the other amazing qualifications she has, but I think we're ready to dive in.
That sounds
So I do ask people to please hold their questions until the end of the presentation, and then those coupled with some others that you were kind enough to provide with us with ahead of time, we'll make every effort to answer them, and anything we can't get to tonight, we will make sure that we get answers and post them along with the recording later on. All right, so without further ado, welcome, Diane. We'd love to hear from you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank everybody for attending. I have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to try not to talk too quickly. And people, if we don't get to your questions, since I have a lot to say, feel free to email me. I can later put my email in the chat, or you can always contact info@pdanorthamerica.org too. And we can make sure your questions get answered. So I'm going to share my screen now, which is always, I feel like that's magic. And all right, you guys can see this, right? Okay. All right. And yeah, ask questions in the chat, and then hopefully we'll get to them at the end. And I'm going to, talk about PDA today, which is fairly new in America, but we've been working on awareness. So, maybe even put in the chat if you've heard of PDA before, or if you're brand new to it, or how you've heard about it. And it is kind of something that is on many people's minds, and hopefully your all's. But I want to kind of start with that, which I thought was a slide, but maybe not. No, I must have taken that out. That how PDA began. All right, no, I don't have it. Yes, I do. All right, I'm going to skip around, right? I've been like 2 minutes into it and I'm already skipping around. So I'm going to give you some history before I talk about PDA North America, because that works for my brain. And just so I'm going to talk about autism today, and PDA. And I was diagnosed autistic at age 65. So I'm looking at PDA with a different lens. But for my brain, I like to know the history of things, how we got to where we are. And I think that it's a interesting story for PDA. So in the 80s, in the UK, a psychologist, Elizabeth Newson, was diagnosing kid after kid as autistic. And she noticed this subgroup of children who were very much like each other, but very different than the majority of autistic kids. And one of the traits that stood out to her was that they avoided everyday demands. And she coined the term pathological demand avoidance for this group. And she, on purpose, chose the word pathological because she wanted people to know that these kids just couldn't help it. They weren't being difficult on purpose. They just could not help avoiding demands. It's an unfortunate word. I'll talk about that probably in a minute, but she meant well. So that was the 80s. And then over the next years, there became kind of a little bit more awareness, still just staying in the UK. And the first book on PDA was in 2011, and that was by Phil Christie and Ruth Fidler, called Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance in Children. And probably the world leader in PDA is the PDA Society in the UK. And they were only established in 2014. So it hasn't been around that long, but UK is ahead of us, but we're going to catch up, I think. All right, now I'm going to kind of go backwards. I think that, like most things that have happened in the world with disability, at least that I know of, things changed because a parent or a group of parents, maybe like some of you in the audience today, wouldn't take no for an answer. And that's really how PDA North America started. I had been working in autism for decades, and a lot of things pop up when you work in autism. People have new ideas, big ideas, and a lot were snake oil or not helpful. And I kind of got in the habit probably of dismissing new things, which is not good. I'm not proud of. And a parent who I'd been working with wouldn't take no for an answer. She sent me article after article about PDA until I started paying attention. I said, all right, I'll read them already. And when I did read them, what really struck me is that I had been working in the field of trauma for a number of years to help out kids in Chicago who were not benefiting from the education they were getting. And there were lawsuits and all kinds of great nonprofit attorneys were trying to get them help. And since I was a social worker and a behavior analyst at that time, I'm not anymore, but I was able to kind of do these lawsuits. And when I read the PDA literature, I was struck by the approach, the recommendations in the PDA articles and books were exactly what I was recommending for these kids with trauma histories in Chicago. So I was sold very quickly, and they were kind of saying it better in the books than I could say it. So I was very impressed. So I thought, all right, I really need to know about PDA. And I found someone in the UK who could train me. And probably a few weeks into that, I thought, all right, this is important. I'm going to have a conference in Chicago. I'm going to invite the person who's training me from the UK. And she was bringing a colleague who is a PDA adult. And I thought, all right, if no one shows up, like Chicago has really good restaurants and she and I will go shopping. But 165 parents showed up in Chicago. March 2020, and there really wasn't a dry eye in the house, because for these families, it was the first time they were in a room with other people who got it, who understood their lived experience, who weren't going to just give them advice and judgment. And I hadn't really thought much past the conference. And I'm a social worker. I had no idea how to do a workshop. We had a book table and I didn't even have a way for them to pay. But everything in the PDA world, like people pitch in, it's really a village. So somebody like figured out how to do Zelle on their phone so people could buy books. But I've learned since then. Not so much, but I've learned some things. But it became clear at that PDA conference in 2020 that this was a beginning of something, not an ending. And we formed PDA North America. And for most of us, March 2020 rings a bell because that's when the pandemic started. I got the speakers from the UK back on kind of the last flights to Europe, and the world shut down. We were buying lots of hand sanitizer at the hotel gift shop. People were taking the toilet paper from the hotel rooms back with them because the shortage was already announced. It was a crazy time, but things slowing down for me allowed me to get a website up on PDA. And I did that because I wanted families to have a something to show for about PDA, like something that, you know, people couldn't say it's not real because the parents or PDA people themselves could say, look, like we have a website, it's a real thing. So now we've changed the website and it's much fancier and bigger, and PDA North America has really grown. And I'm going to tell you in this hour, you know, specifics about characteristics about PDA and how to support people who fit this profile. So if you're in the audience and you're feeling anxious, I haven't gotten to that, I will. But I want to talk a little bit about PDA North America. It'd be great if anyone is interested to spend some time on that website. So www.pdanorthamerica.org. And we have all kinds of downloadable resources and events. And we just added a new kind of blog section called Insights. And we do at least 2 webinars a month, and then also like an Ask Me Anything with a professional. We have a free new to PDA webinar the first Thursday night of every month. So I have one tonight. And we're really trying to spread awareness and give knowledge to people. We just finished in March our 5th annual conference. And in 2023, we had 205 people participate, mostly parents. And in 2024, we had over 500. So more than doubled. And I'm a little nervous what this March is going to bring, but I've started working on it already. We've started some support groups that are free. Support groups. We do some training programs for professionals and parents, but we want professionals to understand PDA so they can support PDA individuals and their families. So we have on the website, a PDA affirming professional list that has hundreds of professionals so people can get the correct advice and understanding and support. And I had no clue how to write a book, but I figured that out too. And in part is by writing a book with someone who knows how to write a book, Ruth Fiddler, who wrote most of the PDA books in the UK. And she and I wrote a book, Navigating PDA in America, which came out in June. So you can buy that now on Amazon or your favorite local bookstore. And it's just come out, and hopefully it's going to make a difference in people's lives. And as we grew, it became clear that we needed to become a nonprofit. So we became a nonprofit in January 2023. We've been really busy helping people, so we haven't spent too much time on fundraising, which I think a lot of you can relate to. But it is important to us that no one's ever turned down from any of our events because of funds. So eventually we're going to get a grant, but people have been generous. And besides the conferences, I think like a lot of people diagnosed as autistic, like when I get a thought in my head, I make it happen, or I have to make it happen. So I have this idea for regional workshops, and we're having our first one in the Boston area, September 20th. And at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about that too. So we are growing and doing more things all the time, and want to meet the needs of families who include someone with PDA. Okay, yeah. All right, so when I first started being interested in working in PDA, and still today, I'm struck by the similar stories I hear from parents who call me or email me. And it doesn't matter if it's a parent of a 5-year-old on a farm in Iowa, or a parent of a 15-year-old in Manhattan. Their experiences have been so similar that it's been so striking to me, and really motivated me to build this awareness of PDA. Parents always say when they heard about PDA, it was a light bulb moment, and their child had many diagnoses when they found PDA, including oppositional defiant disorder, which really makes me crazy, and sometimes bipolar disorder, and all kinds of incorrect diagnoses. And the parents would say, that's just, I knew it just didn't really fit, and my gut told me something was missing. And many parents, parents know best, really, and are most motivated. So a lot of parents did their own research and said, I really think my kid's autistic, and took them for evaluations and assessments, and were told that their child couldn't be autistic because their child made eye contact, their child was so communicative and talkative, and their child really was socially motivated or imaginative. So their child absolutely could not be autistic. And one of the hardest things that I still hear from parents every day is that the parents tried so hard to follow the guidance they were given by professionals, and at school or therapists, or even parenting books, and none of those things worked, and sometimes even made things worse. And that's why, for me, it's just so important to really understand PDA. Just going to say for a minute about the name. So I had said it was called, for good reason at the beginning, pathological demand avoidance. But in recent years, some of the PDA adults in the UK have renamed it pervasive drive for autonomy, not only to get rid of the word pathological, but also because they feel that this drive for autonomy is so much more important than the demand avoidance. And the demand avoidance is really a symptom of the need for autonomy. So that's something to think about. There's a few PDA adults I know in the UK who like pathological demand avoidance. So, people can choose their own terminology. I just wanted to put that out. So my first conversation with Ruth Fiddler in the UK about PDA, I had this whole like list of questions, and as soon as I started, she kind of shut me down, and in a very polite British way, and said, we can't really talk about PDA until we talk about autism, because in America, your understanding of autism is so behind. And I was like, oh no, I was really taken back. And now I'm so grateful that we had that conversation, and she's so right. And I'm really hoping in my heart of hearts that part of the PDA kind of movement can be helping people understand autism more correctly. And someone who was actually in Chicago, Dr. Devin Price, he has a really nice book on unmasking autism, where he talks about this, that we have this whole wrong image of autism, and his work was trying to change it. A couple of things I really like that he talks about that are pertinent for many autistic people and himself. And he was diagnosed as an adult. And he talks about just being hyper reactive to even small stimuli in the environment, and having trouble distinguishing between information and sensory data that should be ignored versus data that should be carefully considered. So those are so much more important, I think, those traits, than how we typically talk about an autistic presentation. And he also points out such an important thing, that processing a situation takes more time and energy than it does a neurotypical person. And that is so true, and it impacts every part of life. And our systems are not always responsive to that or take into consideration how much more time and energy it takes an autistic person to. And in Washington, there's Maryland, I guess, a really great psychologist who wrote a book, Is This Autism? And what she says is that being autistic at its core just means having a different type of nervous system. And people who have this type of nervous system experience, process, and respond to the world differently than non-autistics. And again, that's such a more helpful view. And we can't really separate understanding PDA from understanding autism, but it's understanding autism correctly. What's usually taught or written about in terms of autism is this stereotypical autism. And we also need to consider that actually the majority of autistic people fall into kind of a non-stereotypical presentation, and that's where PDA lives, in this non-stereotypical presentation of autism. So this stereotypical autism, even though I don't like behavioral checklists, this is more kind of general characteristics. And I do want to say, there's that saying too in autism, if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, which is so true. And there's a danger in any kind of presentation like this, where you're talking about a group of people, that you're generalizing. So I'm apologizing for that, and want people to keep in mind about the individual differences. And I'll remind you through this too. But even in categories. So generally, how we're taught about autism, and people still are taught this way, is just this part of the picture, right? The stereotypical autism. People are concrete and pragmatic, like routine. Their social differences stand out more. They're more noticeable. They might not express their empathy as directly. things are more externalized for them. They have high anxiety, and their nervous systems can go into fight or flee pretty easily. And non-stereotypical autism, which again is PDA is a part of, there's so much more camouflaging, and it's so much more internal and existential. And the special interests blend in socially and culturally so much more that they're not generally standing out as special interests. When I was getting diagnosed, the psychologist said, you know, autism is often one of those special interests. Really? Oh, okay. Hyper empathetic and high anxiety and fawning, that kind of like fitting in, trying to please, fighting and fleeing too. So we really, really have to move away from this traditional view of autism to understand PDA. It's a way of experiencing the world. It's not a list of behaviors. And unfortunately, in most schools, to have a student classified as autistic, you go through this list of behaviors. It's so horrible to me. It's really triggering too. And what is striking also about understanding autism correctly is that it's much more inclusive of girls and women. In PDA, the genders are equal, where most of us who are taught about autism, we're taught that it's 4 more times, you know, diagnosed in males, but that's just because that's how we look at it too. There's a psychologist I like in Belgium who has done some work about prediction differences and difficulty in context. And if you want to hear more, he's a good person too. So there's a few kind of like heroes in the PDA world, and Christy Forbes is one of them. She's a PDA adult raising PDA kids in Australia. She is fabulous, really articulate, a great writer, and she's gonna join us at our next March conference for a while by Zoom. So I'm very excited. And what I love about her work is that she talks about like moving away from the kind of gloom and doom narrative of autism to a positive autistic identity and culture, and also the movement away from autism as a medical disorder to an identity. And she has all kinds of stuff online. She's really very, very cool and kind, really kind. I put this slide in, even though it doesn't really fit, just as a reminder that everyone's unique. And there's also so many co-occurring conditions that can go along with autism and PDA, and which causes difference in people as well. There's a few, well, I guess a couple little assessments. They're not really supposed to be used for diagnoses. There's one kind of on the PDA Society, and then there's another one online made by 2 PDA adults. Assessments, I think, have a lot of limitations, but I put them in there because people always ask about assessments. All right, so now I'm going to talk just about the characteristics of PDA, which is probably what people want, right? So individuals who fit this PDA profile appear to have better social understanding and communication skills than other autistic people, and they can use that to their advantage, which often serves to mask the difficulty they're having, especially in social situations. So it can be a hidden disability, which means that PDAers are not getting what they need in terms of support. And often PDAers kind of suffer because of that. So here's some just quick features. Resist and avoids ordinary demands of life. We all avoid certain things, but this is everyday demands, and using social strategies as part of the avoidance, distracting, giving excuses, appearing sociable, wanting to be sociable, but still having problems navigating situations and relationships. PDAers are known for fast and drastic mood changes. And there's so many reasons, including just the intensity of their emotions, hypervigilant, how sensitive they are. And PDA people can be very impulsive, in part just trying desperately to feel better. Many PDAers are also diagnosed as having ADHD as well. A striking thing for PDAers is they can act very differently in different settings. And it can be a good thing and a really problematic thing. Often how that plays out is a child being like the perfect student in school and then falling apart as soon as their parent picks them up. And then when the parent gives this information to school, often the response is, well, this must be a home problem or a parenting problem because your kid is great at school. And it can cause huge problems and take a toll on the individual who is just holding it together so tightly and masking in school. And I'll talk a little bit about masking. PDAers have a really hard time following routines and requests of other people. And sometimes they can't even make themselves do things they want to do. They, in general, have an anxiety-based need for control. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Generally, even before I knew PDA, I used to say, when you find someone who's really controlling, there's probably anxiety underneath, because that's how we can dampen down our anxieties, by taking control. Another kind of unique thing about this population is they don't really pay attention or care about hierarchy or age differences. You know, a first grade PDAer might not think that they need to talk any differently than to the school principal than a peer. I think it's, you know, in part, they think respect should be, deserved. Not, it just doesn't happen because of someone's title. PDAers are very comfortable in role play and pretend, and can use that pretend to both comply with demands and avoid demands. Like other autistic people, PDAers can be obsessive, but it's much more likely that they're obsessed with people, not objects. And that can be a lot easier if they're obsessed with like a rock star than if they're obsessed with the girl who sits next to them in Algebra 2. And because of those obsessions and challenges in understanding the social world, social problems can happen. And PDA, especially children, can appear to be very controlling and dominating in social situations. Because they're not really feeling secure. In secure situations, PDAers can be very charismatic and engaging. And autistic people are often judged as not being sensitive, but it's not true. And PDAers are so sensitive, they absorb their emotions around them. So people really have to be emotionally regulated when they're around PDAers. They're like sponges. And sometimes that's too much, so they might have to protect themselves and appear callous. And at times they're just going to be too anxious to worry about anyone else, but even how their behavior impacts other people, because they're just trying to be okay. PDAers are known for having meltdowns, and they can be very aggressive. And we have found it's so much better to think of these periods of emotional dysregulation like they're panic attacks, because when people have panic attacks, they're greeted with empathy and people offer help, where when people think they're behavioral problems, people just tell them rules or threaten consequences, and it's not so helpful. And sometimes we forget that when someone is in a meltdown or panic attack, they're not really able to problem solve or process language. I'm gonna start moving up because time is going. Sally Catter, who's a famous PDAer in the UK, she also talks about internalized meltdowns where people can just be really nasty verbally, and it can result in self-harm too. So we all kind of know what we have in our head about demands, since we're talking about demand avoidance, and they're usually kind of direct demands, but they also can be casual and just asking to go get ice cream or watch a movie. But we don't always realize there's so many expectations in the world, and those are demands too. There's a PDAer I knew that said as a kid, he'd come down in the morning and his mom would say good morning. And the expectation that he was supposed to say good morning back was enough to set his day off on the wrong foot, just because of the demand. And PDAers often want a lot for themselves and aren't always able to do the demands they want for themselves. And it can even be eating or go to the bathroom or talking, and they can't make themselves do that. And PDAers use all kinds of ways to try to avoid. And often it is socially acceptable, like distraction. And rarely is it directly refusing, but it can be, especially young kids. But sometimes it's manipulating situations so they stay in control. Negotiation, which earlier in my career I thought was a bad thing, I have found that now, knowing PDAers, often by negotiating, it's the only way they can have enough control to be able to acquiesce and please someone. Same as kind of delaying. They might not be able to do something now, but they might be able to do it if they take control for later. But a lot of the things that I thought were unhelpful, I've learned from PDAers are helpful. And just like all these things that people do to reduce their anxiety, just that being demanding or bossy or ordering someone else to do something. And what I realized too from PDAers is sometimes doing something shocking or outrageous is a way to quickly get control when someone feels out of control. And all the behaviors in my career I thought of as self-sabotage are also ways people use control to manage their anxiety. I'm going to just talk about this for a second. I don't know if people have heard of the polyvagal theory. It's interesting, and it's relevant to PDA and autism. It's just about that humans have behavioral responses that represent a person's nervous system, and our nervous systems always regulate our body's response to threat. And sometimes that looks like challenging behavior. So we have survival instincts, and they're in 3 underlying states, right? So social engagement, and then defense, fight or flight, or life threat, which is shut down or freeze. And I really think that is behind all the challenging behaviors we see. And he also talks about neuroception, which is this subconscious surveillance of safety and threat in the environment. It's always there for all our humans, but some people, especially autistic and PDA people, have much more sensitive neuroception. They sense threat even when no one else sees it there, and they have very sensitive threat responses. And that's what I see happening with children and adults who are struggling. The other thing sometimes we forget is that humans are wired for connection, and that is how to prevent people from going into fight, flight, or freeze. It's that human connection. But often that's kind of withdrawn when someone is struggling. So PDA is an autistic profile. So PDA people, even though they appear different than the majority of autistic people, the majority of autistic people, they still kind of have the same challenges in social skills, sensory differences, handling emotions, anxiety, and interoception, which is really reading your body's signals, knowing your internal world. But PDAers have more frequent eye contact. They like spontaneity. They don't like routine. They're so imaginative. They express empathy all the time. And they can instinctively mask. They can hide their distress too. Rewards, including praise, can cause problems for PDAers, which is an important thing for people to know. And this is just a slide I'm not going to go into, but just there's other ways that autistic people avoid demands that aren't the same as PDAers. So supporting PDAers, it's really a mindset more than a strategy. It's about choosing priorities, using indirect language, being spontaneous and fun, listen to understand, and really focus on the relationship, not using rewards and consequences, kind of trying to make things interesting to them and not stating the obvious, not being redundant. But sometimes you can depersonalize rules saying, Department of Health says this, school rules, Department of Education says this, in an effort to support them in doing things that have to be done. But generally, collaboration, partnership, sharing tasks as equals makes all the difference. And it's all about having a trusting relationship. I think it's easy for us to forget that stress is cumulative. We get stuck looking for triggers and focus on the last straw. And sometimes, especially because we have nervous systems and we can get lit up too, that we need to remember that emotions are contagious. So our emotions are contagious. So we don't want to encourage masking or unmasking. We want people to be their authentic self. And a lot of PDAers and other autistic people can't really act on something unless it makes sense to them. So helping explain things, helping things make sense. For most autistic and PDA people, they have to make deliberate choices if what is asked of them is worth the energy and the stress. At PDA North America, we joke, is the juice worth the squeeze? Because it has to be worth it. And I think a lot of us don't realize that. I think the goal of support for individuals who seek professional support is just that self-understanding, learning about their bodies and their feelings and what they need and how to talk about it. But what doesn't work in supporting them is PDAers can't be pushed, they can't be pressured, but that doesn't mean to leave them on their own because they can easily feel ignored. Just a couple things quickly on behavior, because I wanted to leave some time for questions. Russ Green up in your area, he says a lot of things, but what I like best for what he says is that challenging behavior is only a sign or a signal that there is a problem. It's not the problem. And one of the reasons that I figured out, which is why I'm not a behavior analyst anymore for a number of reasons, but is that behavioral approaches don't work. Like looking at the antecedent doesn't work. It's only the last straw. And also sometimes we can make short-term gains behaviorally at long-term expense. And that is not doing people a favor. I've also figured out that one of the reasons people I've worked with go from 0 to 60 in a minute is because their baseline is 50 or 55. They are always anxious. And a lot of people have never lived any differently. They don't even know that other people don't feel like this, right? It's their norm, but that's why it's so easy to kind of escalate. And I generally say when someone is really having a hard time in terms of emotional regulation, sometimes we can't make things better, but we can really work to avoiding making things worse because it is so easy to make things worse. And another PDA, Julia Don, talks about how much time she needs to recover between tasks. And what I'm struck by kind of her work on that is our systems aren't set up that way. Kids are expected to go to school 5 days a week. Adults are expected to work every day. And PDAers often need a lot of recovery time between tasks. And that can cause people not to be able to go to work or school. So just quickly to fight the urge to give consequences or threaten autistic PDA people if they're struggling. You don't have to worry about holding your kids accountable. Adults, we talk too much and we get in trouble with them and lose their trust if we dismiss their reality, even if we don't agree to it, or try to talk them out of their own experiences. Reminding people of rules or expectations doesn't help because everyone knows the rules and expectations. That's not what is getting in the way. When we express disappointment, that gets in the way. We're all taught as parents and professionals that after a big struggle, we're supposed to process it and talk about it. And we really don't. So I'm giving you guys permission, to just move on. You don't have to rehash anything. And don't kind of get stuck with you're letting them get away with it if you don't give a consequence or talk about it. I'm going to show you the flyer at the end we're doing a one-day workshop with Linda Murphy, who wrote the Declarative Language Handbook. And she's going to talk about declarative language, which is just a great strategy kind of for human communication. And you're just talking, commenting aloud, sharing observations. There's no correct response or incorrect. There's no demand. It's just a great way if you've got tricky kids to learn. And this slide is just to point out everyone has a window of tolerance. So depending on where people are in their window of tolerance, we have to really ask ourselves, how important is the demand? How important is what we want from them? And one of the problems was how we all think about behavior is we pay attention to what's above the water using this iceberg model. We pay attention to the tip. That's the observable behavior. But where we need to support PDAers and vulnerable complex kids is all the stuff happening underneath. It's where sensory differences, anxiety, processing delays, all that lives, including trauma. But the hardest part really in all this is when we're parenting or supporting someone, especially a PDAer, is keeping ourselves cool, emotionally regulating ourselves, because we can't co-regulate, which is what people need, what nervous systems need, is that connection to prevent them from going into fight or flight, or to get out of fight or flight. They need a nervous system that's regulated. So we have to fight the punitive parts of ourselves. We need to practice self-care, and we need to kind of just fess up when we make a mistake, because we're certainly going to. There's some references at the back, and this is just a little flyer on the, oh yeah, wrong one. This is the Maryland one. I will send you guys the Boston one. Sorry, I didn't proofread it. Since I'm so bad at tech, I asked someone else to put the flyer in and they put the wrong one. Never mind. I will send you guys so it can be sent out with the recording. I will send you guys the September 20th one in Boston. Yeah, I should have checked. Sorry. All right. So we have a few minutes for questions. I went fast. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it was chock full of all kinds of information. I know I, for one, learned a great deal, and I can tell you that there's been a lot of conversation in the chat. It's striking to me how many people are feeling the validation and are starting to see some of what they've been experiencing and having a better understanding of it, and some names of some really good books that are out there apparently as well.
Good. All right. I love this.
So, but there is a question here that actually was the same one that was going through my head. So as you start listening to the differences and the challenges in working with these very special people, how do you work with public schools to support students that have this condition? Because everything we typically do, as you just talked about, appears to be the wrong way to go. So
it's
first, and how do you help schools to understand it?
Yeah, it is so, oh, these are great questions. It is so hard. I probably do a school meeting once a week with a family, and once I did 5 in a week, which I will never do because I cannot keep my emotional regulation. It is so hard. At PDA North America, our summer project, even though now I'm freaking out, it's August, is to make a school-based training program that schools can buy and use. It's so hard because schools are compliance based, and how our current school system structure developed was really to create good factory workers as part of the industrial revolution. And they needed people who are compliant, who follow directions without questioning them, and could tolerate boredom. And things have not changed in our schools since then. What the positive part, I'm always like, regulate myself, I have to look for positive stuff, is in schools across the country, there is, often like a teacher who's never heard about PDA, who doesn't probably know something about autism, but just naturally is compassionate and kind and attuned and responsive, who can figure out how to just join with a kid and be collaborative and kind. And that gives me hope. But it's hard. We are asking, I mean, it's hard in some ways and not so hard in others. I mean, it's just about utter flexibility. Like I've had conversations, maybe it was actually in your area, with a teacher who was saying like she had to call the kid out every time he talked out of in class. I'm like, I know you think you do, but you don't. You really don't. He knows he's not supposed to. You don't have to tell him each time. So we're kind of stuck in these patterns and giving consequences. We're also stuck in just, how we do things. Like I say to teachers, if he doesn't do the worksheet, it's really not like the end of the world, right? Like, why can't he opt in or opt out? Or why can't he show you what he knows or that he can write by writing about, I don't know, Minecraft and not what he did over summer vacation? Like, we need to be flexible. We need to differentiate, I think, learning from kind of what we want from students, because generally PDAers want to learn. And somehow we don't think about learning. We think about product, and it all has to look a certain way. But these, across the world, PDAers generally are homeschooled and unschooled because, I'm looking at some of the chat, because the schools are so rigid. And sometimes I feel like when I'm at these meetings, which I go to because, parents should never have to go alone, is I think like, am I speaking the same language as them? Like, it makes so much sense in my head, but school people look at me with these like blank stares. So it does take a whole paradigm shift, mostly away from compliance.
Now, it's my understanding that PDA is not included in the DSM.
DSM.
So if it's not included in the DSM, how does a child, or for that matter, another person asked an adult,
Yes, get diagnosed.
receive the diagnosis?
So I just wrote a blog about this for the PDA North America thing. Not everybody's gonna agree with me. So this is my sense. I personally, I'm just speaking for myself, like, I don't think the DSM is so important, because in my head, PDA is in there. It's autism. But the problem is that the description of autism is too narrow. And we are making headway with training psychologists to do assessments correctly, to diagnose autism, to then put a paragraph saying this individual would be best understood by looking at the PDA profile of autism, describing PDA, and then most importantly, having at the end that recommendation part, having PDA affirming recommendations, not the classic stereotypical autistic ones that, you know, kind of will be about ABA therapy and providing kind of very strict behavior plan with rewards and consequences and tons of structure. But I think it's a better use of our resources. And I think we can get psychologists on board to look at autism so they don't have to start new. But from a parent perspective, you know, like the joke is always kind of, you have to get an autism diagnosis and then you have to tell everyone to do everything the opposite of what they think they should do for an autistic person. So it's not an easy sell. And I saw some individuals are on anti-anxiety medicine. It's also individual, and probably what the important part is having a good relationship with the prescriber, so you can really see if it's helping. It helps some people, not all, but many PDAs are on anti-anxiety. There's all these good questions.
Yeah,
Even
there's a
the
lot of
ODD
questions in here,
stuff.
but unfortunately, we only have a minute
I know,
left.
and people can email. We've just started a list of schools, hoping it will help. I go to meetings, and we have other people who can support people. Oh, I haven't heard of that book. Listen. All right, I'm gonna save the chat.
So unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap this up because it looks like, just based on the chat and of course and just having your expertise here, we go on for hours talking about PDA, which I'm sure you would, I can tell. But we so thank you, Diane, for helping us to get a little bit more understanding about this diagnosis and the wonderful people who experience it and understand, and a better understanding on how to interact with them. As always, folks, any questions that are in the chat that we haven't had the opportunity to answer, we will make sure that we answer them and include them in the email that you'll receive with the PowerPoint presentation and the recording tonight.
We also the flyer for the September event.
Yes, and the flyer for the September event for the PDA conference here in Boston. So thank you again, Diane, for being with us.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
And speaking of events that are happening in September, if you haven't heard yet, the Federation for Children with Special Needs is having their 50th anniversary this year. And on September 28th, we'll be holding their annual gala to celebrate that and the many things that we've been able to achieve in partnership with families across the state. In support of children and youth with special health needs. There is a special going on, a $50 discount for tickets. So please make sure that you go to the website and take advantage of that opportunity. We do hope that we'll see you there, and we will see you again next month as we are getting ready to go into our new school year for our next installment with Connecting Families. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Diane, for all of this rich information. And we will make sure that we get all of the information shared tonight and additional things to support it in the email to all of you. Have a fantastic rest of your summer. Please stay hydrated and safe and take a little time to take care of yourself. Have a great evening. Thank you for coming tonight.